At 69, he walked into a British election carrying a manifesto so thick it looked like a brick, and the country laughed. Newspapers turned him into a cartoon. The scruffy old man in a donkey jacket, the relic from another age. But rewind the tape far enough and you find a different image. A boy in a respectable home, staring at the machinery of power, learning, almost against his will, that words can be weapons, and that a single voice can make the mighty flinch. Michael Foot's story begins not with a punchline, but with a fuse being lit. And it keeps burning, right up to the moment time itself starts to run out. He was born on 23 July 1913 in Plymouth, a naval city where the sea air tastes of salt and empire. The First World War was already tightening its grip on Europe, and Britain's confidence still wore a uniform. Foot's family belonged to the world of public service and civic pride. His father, Isaac Foot, was a liberal politician, principled, hard-working, the kind of man who believed politics was a moral calling rather than a career. In that household, arguments weren't a hobby. They were a form of education. The dinner table was a training ground. The young Michael absorbed the rhythms of speeches, the weight of ideas, the thrill of persuasion. He learned early that politics wasn't just what happened in Parliament. It was what happened in people's lives. He went to school at Leighton Park, a Quaker institution, where the emphasis on conscience and peace left a mark. The Quaker tradition didn't simply preach kindness. It demanded consistency. If you believed something, you had to live it. That kind of moral pressure can either crush a person or forge them. For Foot, it became a kind of inner engine. Restless, idealistic, sometimes infuriatingly uncompromising. From there, he went to Wadham College, Oxford. Oxford in the early 1930s was a place where the future rulers of Britain learned to speak with effortless authority. But outside the college walls, the world was cracking. The Great Depression had turned unemployment into a national wound. In Europe, fascism was rising like a dark tide. The old liberal order, Foot's inheritance, looked increasingly helpless. And in that atmosphere, the young man who had been raised in the liberal tradition began to drift leftward, not as a fashionable rebellion, but as a response to what he saw as emergency. If democracy was going to survive, he believed, it needed more than polite speeches. It needed courage, and it needed action. Foot had a gift that made him dangerous. He could write, not just clearly but vividly, like someone painting with words. Journalism became his first battlefield. He worked for newspapers, sharpening his style, learning how to land a sentence like a punch. In the 1930s, the press wasn't merely reporting politics, it was shaping it. And Foot wanted to shape it toward justice, toward resistance, toward a Britain that would not bow to dictators abroad or to poverty at home. Then came the moment that would define his early public identity, his fierce opposition to appeasement. While many in the British establishment clung to the hope that Adolf Hitler could be managed, negotiated with, soothed, Foot saw something else, an abyss opening. He wasn't alone, but he was loud, and he was relentless. He attacked the complacency of those who treated fascism as just another foreign policy problem. To him, it was a moral emergency, a test of whether Britain's leaders had any spine. In 1940, with Europe in flames and Britain facing invasion, Foot co-wrote a book that detonated like a bomb in the political world. Guilty Men. It was published under a pseudonym, Cato, because the accusations inside were so explosive. The book named names. It blamed leading politicians for the failures that had left Britain dangerously unprepared for war. Imagine the atmosphere, bombs falling, families huddled in shelters, and suddenly a book appears saying, in effect, this didn't have to be so close. This fear, this blood, this desperation. Someone made choices. Someone failed. Someone must be held accountable. That book didn't just criticize, it indicted. It helped shape the public narrative of the 1930s, turning appeasement into a stain that would cling to reputations for decades. Foot was still young, but he had already learned a brutal lesson. If you strike at the powerful, you don't get polite disagreement. You get enemies. And yet, even as he fought the right, Foot's political identity was never simple. He was a man of the left, but not a man who surrendered his mind to a party line. He admired radical change, but he also revered parliamentary democracy. He could be romantic about socialism, but he was also deeply British in his attachment to liberty and debate. That tension, between fiery conviction and constitutional faith, would follow him like a shadow. The war years intensified everything. Britain was mobilized, rationed, exhausted. The old social order was being questioned in real time. If the nation could organize itself to fight a war, why couldn't it organize itself to fight poverty? That question hung in the air like smoke. Foot's writing and speaking grew more urgent. He wasn't content to be a commentator. He wanted to be inside the arena. In 1945, as the war ended and Britain stood at a crossroads, he entered Parliament as the Labour Member of Parliament for Plymouth, Devonport. The timing mattered. The country was hungry for change, and Labour swept to power in a landslide, promising a welfare state, national health care, and a new social contract. Foot arrived in Westminster at the moment the old Britain was being dismantled and rebuilt. For a young idealist, it was intoxicating. But Parliament is not a lecture hall. It is a machine, full of procedure, compromise, ambition, and quiet cruelty. Foot, with his unruly hair and his booming oratory, stood out. He was not sleek. He was not managerial. He was not the kind of politician who looked like he'd been designed by a committee. He looked like himself. And he spoke like someone who believed every word mattered. He quickly became known as a powerful speaker, a man who could fill the chamber with the force of his voice. Yet even early on, the conflict that would define his life began to sharpen. Michael Foot versus the gravitational pull of the political center. Labour, even in its most reforming moments, contained a constant argument about how far to go, how fast, and at what cost. Foot was drawn to the party's left, toward a vision of socialism that was moral and transformative, not merely administrative. That made him inspiring to some and alarming to others. His first stint in Parliament didn't last. In 1955, he lost his seat. For many politicians, defeat is a kind of death. The phone stops ringing. The corridors forget your name. But Foot didn't vanish. He returned to journalism, and in a twist that would later seem almost prophetic, he became editor of the Tribune, the leading left wing weekly associated with the labor movement. If Parliament had ejected him, he would build a different platform, one made of ink, argument, and relentless pressure. At the Tribune, Foot wasn't just reporting on labor's internal battles. He was participating in them. He championed causes, attacked hypocrisy, defended civil liberties, and argued for a Britain that would not be ruled by fear. Fear of the Soviets, fear of change, fear of its own working class. He became a voice for the left that was intellectual but also emotional, rooted in a sense of decency. He could be scathing, but he could also be tender. He wrote like someone who believed politics was about human beings, not statistics. Then, in 1960, he returned to Parliament, this time as MP for Ebw Vale in South Wales, a seat once held by Aneurin Bevan, the architect of the National Health Service and a hero of the Labour left. Taking that seat was not just a career move, it was an inheritance. Ebw Vale was a place shaped by coal, labor, solidarity, and hardship. It demanded authenticity. It demanded loyalty. And Foot, with his passion and his refusal to polish himself into something more presentable, fit the mood of the constituency. But the clock was already ticking in a way he could not ignore. British politics was changing. Television was turning elections into performances. Party machines were becoming more disciplined. The age of the eccentric, bookish, thunderous orator was being squeezed by the age of the media-trained operator. Foot's strengths, his spontaneity, his literary style, his refusal to simplify, were also vulnerabilities. He was brilliant, but he was not modern. And modernity, in politics, can be a ruthless executioner. Still, he pushed forward. In the 1960s and 1970s, he became a prominent figure on Labour's left, arguing against what he saw as betrayals of principle. He opposed certain defense policies, questioned nuclear weapons, and insisted that Britain's moral authority depended on more than military strength. He was not naive about danger, but he was stubborn about conscience. That stubbornness would later be used against him, twisted into caricature. But at this stage, it was the source of his power. He sounded like someone who meant it. And then came the first real taste of the time limit that would haunt his later life. The sense that history was accelerating. The post-war consensus was fraying. Economic crises were looming. Labour was splitting into factions that distrusted each other like rival tribes. Foot was no longer just a writer with a seat in Parliament. He was becoming a symbol of a certain kind of Labour, a certain kind of Britain, a certain kind of politics that believed ideas mattered more than image. The tension tightened. Because the closer he moved toward the center of power, the more he would have to fight not only the conservatives, not only the press, not only the establishment, but also the fear inside his own party that a man like him could never be allowed to lead. And somewhere ahead, unseen but approaching fast, was the moment when the country would look at Michael Foot and decide whether he was a prophet or a punchline. The seat at EBW Vale came with a ghost in it. Aneurin Bevan had sat there before him. Bevan, the firebrand who built the National Health Service and made the rich tremble with a sentence. Now Michael Foot walked into that inheritance like a man stepping onto a stage where the last actor's applause still echoed. The miners and steelworkers didn't want a polished salesman. They wanted a voice that sounded like it had lived through the same weather. Foot gave them that voice. Big, rolling, literary, furious when it needed to be, tender when it mattered. And in Westminster, where so many men spoke as if they were reading from a memo, he spoke as if the words were burning his mouth. But Britain was changing its rules while he was still learning the new seat. The country that had built the welfare state was now being pulled apart by inflation, strikes, and the slow, grinding sense that the post-war promise was running out. Television was turning politics into a kind of theater where the camera punished every stray hair, every awkward pause, every coat that looked too old. Foot, who looked like he'd been dragged from a library in a storm, was walking into an era that rewarded the opposite of what he was. Inside labor, the argument was becoming a civil war conducted in suits. How socialist should labor be? How close to America? How hard on unions? How committed to nuclear weapons? Foot's instincts were clear. He was a democratic socialist with a moral compass that didn't swivel for convenience. He distrusted the idea that Britain's greatness depended on the ability to incinerate cities. He believed the country's strength should be measured in hospitals, housing, and dignity. And he had a particular hatred for the way fear was used as a political tool. Fear of the Soviet Union, fear of economic collapse, fear of the unions, fear of the left. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he became one of the most recognizable voices on labor's left, not because he played factional games well, he didn't, but because he could make an argument sound like a moral drama. He could take a policy dispute and turn it into a question of national character. That made him powerful. It also made him dangerous to people who wanted politics to be managerial, calm, and controllable. Then came the moment when the country itself seemed to lose control. By 1974, Britain was staggering. The miners' strike had brought down Edward Heath's conservative government after he asked the public, "Who governs Britain?" And the answer came back like a slap. "Not you." Labour returned to power under Harold Wilson, and suddenly Foot was no longer just a voice from the backbenches. He was pulled toward the machinery of government, toward the place where ideals meet paperwork, where promises meet budgets, where every decision leaves fingerprints. He became Secretary of State for Employment. It was a job that put him right on the fault line between government and unions, between the need to keep the economy alive and the need to keep labor's soul intact. The country was a pressure cooker. Wages chasing prices, prices chasing wages, industries creaking, tempers flaring. Foot, the romantic socialist, now had to negotiate with hard men who could shut down the country with a vote. He wasn't a technocrat. He wasn't a cold strategist. But he had something else. A deep, almost instinctive respect for working people and their organizations. He could talk to union leaders without contempt, and that alone made him unusual in a political class that often treated unions like a disease. In 1976, Harold Wilson resigned suddenly, and the Labour Party had to choose a new leader. The contest brought out the party's internal geography like a map under bright light. James Callaghan won, and Foot, despite being identified with the left, was brought into the center of power again, this time as leader of the House of Commons. It was a role that demanded not just speech-making but discipline, managing the government's business, keeping fragile majorities alive, negotiating with opponents who smelled blood, and the government was fragile. Labour's majority had evaporated. Every vote became a cliff edge. Every by-election felt like a warning shot. Foot, who loved Parliament as a living institution, now had to keep it functioning while the country's patience thinned. He was, in effect, trying to hold together a ship in a storm while the crew argued about the destination. Then the storm turned into something worse: humiliation. In 1976, Britain went to the International Monetary Fund for a loan, the IMF. The very phrase sounded like a verdict. For a Labour government, supposed to be the party of national independence and working-class pride, being forced to ask for help from international financiers felt like a national shaming. The loan came with conditions: spending cuts, restraint, the language of austerity creeping into a party that had promised protection. Foot watched the argument tear through Labour like a saw. To many on the left, it looked like surrender. To others, it looked like survival. Foote was not blind to economic reality, but he was sickened by the idea that the country's choices were being narrowed by markets and institutions no one had elected. And while Labour wrestled with its own contradictions, the Conservatives were changing shape. A new figure was rising, sharp, disciplined, and utterly convinced. Margaret Thatcher didn't just oppose Labour. She despised what she thought Labour had done to Britain's spirit. She spoke of unions as enemies within. She spoke of the state as a burden. She spoke of individualism like a religion. Where Foote's politics were rooted in solidarity, hers were rooted in confrontation. It wasn't just a rivalry of parties. It was a clash of moral universes. By 1978 and 1979, the country was exhausted. The winter of discontent arrived with images that looked like a breakdown of civilization. Rubbish piled in streets, bodies unburied. In some places, strikes spreading like frost. The press turned it into a horror show, and Labour looked helpless. Foote, who had spent his life defending working people, now watched the public mood harden against the very idea of collective action. The unions, once Labour's backbone, were being recast as villains in a national drama. In March 1979, the Labour government fell by a single vote in a motion of no confidence. One vote. That's how thin the line was between power and collapse. The election that followed brought Thatcher into Downing Street, and Britain stepped into a new era, one that would treat Foote's kind of socialism not as a respectable tradition but as something to be crushed. For Foote, the defeat wasn't just political, it was personal. He had spent decades believing that Britain could be persuaded toward decency. Now he was watching a different Britain emerge. Harder, more suspicious, more willing to accept inequality as the price of freedom. And inside Labour, the defeat triggered panic, blame, and a fight over identity that would become savage. James Callaghan stayed on briefly, but everyone could feel the leadership question approaching like thunder. The party was splitting into camps that barely trusted each other. The left wanted a clean break from what they saw as compromise and drift. The right, what would later be called the moderates, feared that the left was steering Labour toward electoral suicide. And hanging over all of it was a new kind of political weapon. The media age, where a leader could be destroyed not only by policies, but by image, by tone, by a single photograph. Foote was now in his mid-60s. In most careers, that's the time you step back, write memoirs, give speeches at dinners. But Labour was about to do something that felt, even to some of its own members, like lighting a match in a room full of gas. In 1980, Labour chose Michael Foote as leader. It happened partly because he was respected across factions as a man of principle, partly because he was seen as a unifier, and partly because the party was desperate for a voice that could fight Thatcher with moral force. Foote had never been a slick operator. He wasn't a machine politician. He was a believer. And in a moment of crisis, believers can look like the only honest option. But the moment he took the leadership, the clock started ticking louder. Because Foote didn't inherit a stable party. He inherited a battlefield. The internal war that had been simmering now erupted. The moderates, figures like Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Shirley Williams, and Bill Rogers, broke away to form the Social Democratic Party in 1981. It was a split that felt like an amputation. Labour was bleeding experienced talent, credibility in the eyes of many voters, and, most dangerously, unity. The new SDP allied with the Liberals, creating a centrist force that threatened to squeeze Labour from the middle, while Thatcher attacked from the right. Foote was now fighting on three fronts at once. Thatcher's government, a hostile press, and a party tearing itself apart. And the press did not treat him as a serious statesman in waiting. They treated him as a gift. The scruffy hair, the old-fashioned suits, the habit of speaking in paragraphs rather than slogans. Everything about him was framed as evidence that Labour had chosen a relic. He could deliver a speech that made the Commons crackle, and the evening news would reduce him to a clip that made him look eccentric. In the new politics, the camera could be more lethal than an opponent's argument. Yet Foote wasn't simply a victim of image. He was also making choices, hard ones, controversial ones, that would define his leadership. He was committed to unilateral nuclear disarmament, a position rooted in his moral revulsion at weapons that could erase cities in minutes. He was skeptical of the European Economic Community, seeing it as a constraint on democratic socialism. He supported policies of nationalization and expanded public ownership. To supporters, it was a return to Labour's soul. To critics, it was a manifesto for the past. And then, like a fuse burning toward a deadline, an external crisis arrived that would reshape everything. The Falklands War in 1982. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, and Thatcher responded with force. The country rallied around the flag. The war became a test of patriotism, and Thatcher understood instinctively how to use it. Foote, who had opposed appeasement in the 1930s and had never been soft on dictators, now faced a trap. Oppose the war and be branded unpatriotic. Support it and risk legitimizing Thatcher's militaristic narrative. He backed the task force while criticizing the government's handling and the failures that had led to the invasion. It was a nuanced position, exactly the kind of nuance that gets crushed in wartime politics. Thatcher emerged from the conflict transformed in the public imagination. Decisive, victorious, almost untouchable. Labour, already divided, now looked even more adrift. Foote could feel the ground shifting under him. The next election was coming, and it would not be fought on the terrain he preferred. Poverty, housing, jobs, justice. It would be fought on leadership, strength, and national confidence. The very things the media insisted he did not embody. Still, he pushed forward, because he believed retreat would be a betrayal. He worked to hold the party together, to keep debate alive without letting it become self-destruction. He tried to balance factions that wanted incompatible futures. He faced conference halls where activists demanded purity and parliamentary colleagues who demanded electability. Every day was a negotiation with time. How long could he keep Labour from splitting further? How long before the public decided the argument was over? And as 1983 approached, the deadline became unavoidable. A general election was coming, and Foote, now 70, carrying the weight of a party's history on his shoulders, had to walk into the most unforgiving arena of his life. Not as a commentator, not as a backbench conscience, as the man who would either stop Thatcher or be remembered as the last leader of an old Labour that Britain had decided to leave behind. The election wasn't just coming, it was stalking him. In the spring of 1983, Michael Foote could feel the trap tightening from every direction at once. Thatcher had the glow of the Falklands victory still on her face like fresh paint. The economy was brutal. Factories closing, unemployment climbing past 3 million. But the government had learned how to turn pain into a sermon. Britain must be cured, and if the medicine hurt, that only proved it was working. The press, meanwhile, had decided Foote wasn't a man to be weighed against Thatcher. He was a costume to be laughed at. And inside his own party, the split with the SDP had left Labour looking like a family that had smashed its own furniture and then invited the neighbours in to watch. Foote had a deadline that wasn't negotiable. The Prime Minister would choose the moment, and when she did, he would have weeks, to persuade a country that had started to treat his kind of politics as a museum exhibit. He was 70. He had no time to grow into the role, no time to rebrand, no time to learn the new television grammar where a raised eyebrow could outweigh a paragraph of argument. The clock was already running, and the audience had already been told what to think of him. He tried to fight on the ground he understood. Parliament, principle, the moral case. In the Commons, he could still make the air change. He could turn a debate into a story about what Britain owed its people. He attacked Thatcher's unemployment as a political choice, not a natural disaster. He spoke about communities being hollowed out, mining towns, steel towns, places where the closure of a plant wasn't an efficiency, it was a death in the family. He warned that selling off public assets wasn't modernization, it was a one-time bonfire of inheritance. He argued that a society that could afford nuclear submarines could afford decent housing. But Thatcher didn't need to win the argument in Foote's language. She needed to win in hers. Strength, certainty, command. And she had allies that Foote could never recruit. Headlines, caricatures, the easy cruelty of a joke repeated until it became common sense. Then came the document that would be used like a blunt instrument against him for decades. Labour's 1983 manifesto. It was long, detailed, crowded with commitments. Nationalization, stronger union rights, withdrawal from the European Economic Community, unilateral nuclear disarmament, abolition of the House of Lords in its existing form, sweeping constitutional change. To supporters, it was a serious attempt to reverse a national drift toward inequality and permanent joblessness. To opponents, it was a shopping list of radicalism that looked, on television, like chaos bound in paper. Foote didn't write it alone, no leader does, but it landed on his desk like a weight he would be forced to carry in public. He believed in much of it. He also knew, with a cold clarity, that the country was being asked to take a leap at the exact moment it was terrified of falling. The SDP Liberal Alliance was waiting in the middle, offering voters a way to reject Thatcher without embracing Labour. And Thatcher's team could now paint Foot's labor as not merely wrong, but dangerous. The most explosive issue was nuclear weapons. Foot's opposition wasn't fashionable pacifism. It was a lifetime of argument. He had watched the 20th century invent the ability to erase cities in minutes. He had seen how easily leaders spoke of deterrence, as if it were a polite abstraction, not a plan that ended with children burned into shadows on walls. He believed Britain's nuclear arsenal didn't make the country safer. It made it complicit in a logic of mass murder. Unilateral disarmament, to him, was moral sanity. But morality is a hard sell when fear is the product. Thatcher's Britain was being told that the Soviet Union was a permanent threat, that strength meant missiles, that weakness meant humiliation. Foot's position was turned into a simple insult. He would leave Britain defenseless. He would give up the bomb. He would invite danger. The nuance, his belief in multilateral disarmament, in diplomacy, in reducing the temperature of the Cold War, was flattened into a cartoon. And then, in the middle of this, came the image that would haunt him like a curse, the cenotaph, remembrance. Sunday, 1981, 2 years earlier. But the photograph would be dragged out again and again as the election approached. Foot, attending the ceremony, wore a dark coat that looked, in the still image, like a donkey jacket. The truth was more mundane. It was a warm coat, and he had been told it was appropriate. But politics doesn't run on truth. It runs on pictures. The press seized it. The implication was viciously simple. He didn't respect the dead. He didn't understand the nation. He was out of place at the center of British life. Foot, who had opposed fascism when it was fashionable to appease it, who had supported rearmament against Hitler, who had spent his life arguing that patriotism meant protecting ordinary people, was now being framed as unpatriotic by a photograph of a coat. That's how the new battlefield worked. A lifetime of speeches could be undone by a single frozen frame. As the election neared, he tried to do what he had always done, speak to the country as if it were capable of being persuaded. He went out on the campaign trail with the energy of a man who refused to admit his age. He addressed rallies, factories, halls packed with labor loyalists who still wanted to believe that words could move history. He warned about the social cost of Thatcherism. The way unemployment wasn't just a statistic, but a slow violence. Marriages cracking, health failing, young people leaving, pride turning into bitterness. He argued that Britain was being taught to admire selfishness and call it enterprise. But the campaign wasn't only about what he said, it was about what the country had been trained to see. Television wanted short answers. Foot gave long ones. Television wanted a leader who looked like a commander. Foot looked like a writer who had wandered into the wrong studio. Television wanted a simple story. Labor's story was complicated. Divided party, ambitious program, moral arguments that required attention. Thatcher's story was brutally clean. I am strong, I won a war, I will not turn back. And the alliance was there, smiling in the center, offering a third option that felt, to many voters, like a way to avoid choosing between fear and upheaval. In raw votes, Labour would not collapse completely, but the split opposition would hand Thatcher a landslide of seats. The electoral system would turn division into disaster. Foot could see it happening in real time. He could feel the air changing, the way journalists asked questions with a verdict already inside them. He could sense the impatience in interviews. Why won't you answer like a modern leader? Why won't you simplify? Why won't you become the thing we recognize? But he couldn't become that thing. Not in weeks, not at 70, not after a lifetime of believing that politics was, at its best, a moral conversation with the public. Election Day, June 1983, arrived like a door slamming. The result was catastrophic in seats. Thatcher's Conservatives surged to a huge majority. Labour's vote share held up better than the seat count suggested, but the story was written in the numbers that mattered. The alliance took millions of votes and far fewer seats, but it had done its job. It had split the anti-conservative electorate. Labour was left bloodied, and Foot was left as the face of the defeat. In the aftermath, the knives came out, not only from opponents but from within. The manifesto was mocked as the longest suicide note in history, a phrase that stuck because it was cruel and memorable and therefore irresistible. Foot became, in lazy retellings, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Too left-wing, too old-fashioned, too verbose, too scruffy, too principled for a country that wanted a manager. But that story, neat, humiliating, final, missed what was actually happening inside him. Because Foot did not respond like a man who had been broken. He responded like a man who had been wounded and refused to pretend otherwise. He accepted responsibility, but he did not renounce his beliefs to buy forgiveness. He did not suddenly praise Thatcher's courage. He did not perform the modern ritual of apologizing for having convictions. Instead, he did something rarer. He kept working. In Parliament, he continued to fight the government's direction. He challenged the idea that unemployment was an acceptable tool. He attacked the sell-offs and the weakening of collective bargaining. He warned about the social fracture being normalized. He defended civil liberties when the state expanded its powers. He argued against the creeping idea that compassion was weakness. And he also did something that surprised people who only knew the caricature. He helped manage Labour's transition. Foote had been chosen as a unifier, and in defeat he still tried to be one. He understood that Labour could not remain frozen in a posture that the electorate had rejected. He also understood that if Labour abandoned its moral core entirely, it would become a hollow machine. The problem was that the party's factions didn't merely disagree on tactics, they disagreed on what the party was for. The pressure on him to resign became relentless. He had always known the leadership was a kind of borrowed time. Now the loan was being called in. He announced he would step down, and the contest that followed brought a new figure to the front. Neil Kinnock. Kinnock was younger, sharper on television, and, crucially, ready to confront parts of Labour's own movement that were dragging it toward unelectability. Foote supported him. That support mattered. It was a passing of the torch that could have been bitter, but Foote refused bitterness. He had been bruised by the press, undermined by circumstance, and defeated by a political earthquake, but he would not sabotage the future out of pride. When Kinnock began the painful process of taking on the militant tendency and reshaping Labour's image, Foote did not lead a romantic rebellion against him. He remained a voice of conscience, yes, but not a wrecking ball. He understood that the party had to survive in order to fight again. And yet, even as he stepped back from the leadership, the conflict that had defined his public life did not disappear. It simply changed shape. Foote's real opponent had never been only Thatcher. It had been the idea, spreading through politics like a cold fog, that values were a luxury, that the market was a moral judge, that solidarity was sentimental, that the state was always the problem, that history had ended and the only adult task was management. Thatcher embodied that idea with extraordinary force, but she hadn't invented it. She had given it a voice that sounded like destiny. Foote, in contrast, kept insisting that politics was about people who could be hurt, saved, lifted, abandoned. He kept insisting that a nation was not a balance sheet. He kept insisting that democracy meant more than choosing which elite would administer the same inevitabilities. By 1984, he left the leadership formally behind. The spotlight moved on. The caricature remained. Easy, convenient, endlessly recycled. But in the Commons corridors and among those who had watched him up close, another image persisted. A man who had walked into the most hostile media environment of modern British politics with almost no time. An aging leader handed a divided party and a country, in the grip of a new ideology, and who still tried, stubbornly, almost painfully, to speak as if truth mattered. The tension never fully resolved. Was he a tragic anachronism or a moral warning? Was he the last of an old Labour that had to die, or the keeper of a flame that later generations would quietly borrow? The country, in 1983, delivered its verdict. But history has a habit of reopening cases that seemed closed, especially when the winners start to look less like saviors and more like the architects of a different kind of damage. And as Foote stepped out of the role that had nearly consumed him, the question he left hanging in the air was not small at all. If a man can be destroyed by a photograph of a coat, what chance does any politics of conscience have in the age of images? A photograph had tried to finish him. Now time would try to erase him. After the leadership, Michael Foote did not vanish in a sulk, and he did not reinvent himself as a repentant moderate to win back the people who had mocked him. He did something far stranger in modern politics. He went back to being what he had always been, an MP, a writer, a man who believed that words were not decoration but weapons, and that the fight was not over just because the cameras had moved on. But there was a clock ticking again, and this one was merciless. Not an election timetable set by a prime minister, not a party calendar, not the rhythm of parliament. It was his own body. He was already in his 70s. The years that remained were not a vague horizon. They were a narrowing corridor, and he could feel, with the same clarity he'd felt in 1983, that he had limited time to do one last thing, to stop his life being reduced to a punchline. He stayed in the House of Commons for several more years, representing Ebbw Vale, one of the great labor seats, a place where politics wasn't a hobby but a lifeline. He had been its MP since 1960, and he treated the constituency like a moral contract. Even after the leadership, even after the landslide defeat, he kept turning up, kept speaking, kept arguing. He was no longer the man expected to win the next election. He was the man expected to embody a memory, and he refused to be only that. The 1980s were not kind to the kind of Britain Foot had spent his life defending. The miners' strike tore the country open. Whole industries were dismantled. Communities that had been built around work, hard work, dangerous work, were told that their suffering was the price of modernization. Foot watched it with a fury that never became fashionable. He had warned about this Britain, a Britain where unemployment was treated as a tool, where the state withdrew and then blamed the abandoned for not swimming. And yet, even as he fought, the ground under him shifted. Labor itself was changing. Neil Kinnock was trying to drag the party back from the edge of internal warfare and electoral oblivion. The battles were ugly, public, and sometimes humiliating. Foot could have made himself the patron saint of the wounded left, the man who stood in the doorway and refused to let the party move. He didn't. He had too much respect for the idea of labor as a living thing. He argued, he warned, he pushed back when he thought the soul was being traded away, but he did not set fire to the house out of grief. Then, in 1992, he did something that looked to outsiders like a quiet retirement. He left the Commons. 37 years in Parliament, and more than half a century in public life, and suddenly the stage that had defined him was gone. But the story didn't end. It changed medium. Foot had always been a writer who happened to be a politician, and now the writer stepped forward again. He returned to books, essays, speeches, work that didn't need to fit into a television clip. He wrote about the people he admired and the causes he refused to abandon. He kept alive the memory of a labor tradition that was not only about management and credibility, but about moral outrage at poverty and injustice. He had spent decades being told that his kind of language was old-fashioned. Now he used it anyway, because he no longer had to ask permission. And here came the first twist of his late life. The man who had been ridiculed as a scruffy relic began to be treated slowly as a national treasure. It didn't happen overnight. It happened the way reputations sometimes heal, through exhaustion. The jokes had been told too many times. The caricature had become stale. And as the years passed, something else became visible. Foot had been wrong about some tactics, yes, and his party had been divided. Under him, yes, but he had not been corrupt, not been cynical, not been bought. In an era when politics increasingly looked like a career ladder, his refusal to treat it that way began to look less like incompetence and more like integrity. He also had a private life that never became a tabloid circus, partly because it didn't offer the usual hooks. His marriage to Jill Craigie, writer, filmmaker, a woman of fierce intelligence, was a partnership of politics and culture, argument and affection. They were not a glossy power couple. They were two people who believed that public life should be about something more than personal advancement. Their home became a kind of refuge for conversation, books, and the stubborn belief that ideas mattered. Then came another turn, sharper and more painful. Jill Craigie's health declined. She suffered from Alzheimer's disease, and the illness did what it always does. It stole time in pieces. For a man who had lived by memory, by history, by quotation, by the long thread of political struggle, watching the person closest to him lose her own mind was a cruelty that no opponent could match. This was not a debate he could win with a speech. This was not a vote he could whip. This was the system of the body, indifferent and absolute. He cared for her, and when she died in 1999, the loss hollowed him. The public saw the old man with the famous hair and the old-fashioned sentences. The private reality was quieter. Grief, loneliness, and the sense that the world he had belonged to was thinning out. And yet, even then, he did not retreat into silence. In 2001, at the age of 87, he delivered a speech that startled people who thought he was only a relic. It was at the Labour Party conference, and the party in power was now Tony Blair's. New Labour, polished, media-trained, triumphant. Foot stood up, frail but unbroken, and spoke against the bombing of Afghanistan. He warned about the cycle of violence, about the ease with which war becomes habit, about the moral cost that is always paid later, by people who never voted for it. It was not a speech designed to win. It was a speech designed to remind. and it landed like a stone in a room full of professionals. Because here was the uncomfortable truth. Foot's politics, mocked as naive, had always been anchored in a fear of what states do when they decide that force is the only language. He had lived through the century that invented industrial slaughter. He had watched leaders talk themselves into catastrophe with confident phrases. He had seen how quickly necessity becomes an excuse. And he refused, even at 87, to clap along. The next shock came 2 years later, in 2003, when Britain prepared to invade Iraq. Foot opposed it. Of course he did. But what mattered was not the predictability of his stance. It was the way history suddenly made him look less like a dreamer and more like a man who had been paying attention. The arguments used to sell the war, certainty, urgency, moral clarity, were the same kinds of arguments that had so often collapsed into regret. Foot watched the country being marched toward conflict on claims that would later rot in public. He watched Parliament, the institution he had revered, bend under pressure. And he watched the media, again, reward confidence over caution. This time, though, the tide of public feeling was different. Millions marched. Doubt was not confined to the margins. And in that atmosphere, Foot's old warnings about power, about propaganda, about the human cost hidden behind strategic language sounded less like nostalgia and more like a diagnosis. It was as if the country for a moment remembered why it had once produced politicians like him. And still, the old insult lingered. The donkey jacket, the suicide note, the idea that he had been a joke. Foot's late life became a quiet battle against that reduction. Not through self-pity, not through angry memoirs, but through presence, through continuing to speak, through continuing to write, through continuing to show up as himself, refusing to be edited into his simpler character. He lived long enough to see Thatcher leave office, long enough to see Labour return to power without him, long enough to see the Cold War end, long enough to see the new wars begin. He lived long enough for the political world to become even more image-driven than it had been in 1983. More ruthless, more compressed, more addicted to the instant verdict. And here came the final twist. The very qualities that had made him unelectable began to make him beloved. People who would never have voted for him began to speak of him with affection. Journalists who had once sneered began to write elegiac profiles. There was a hunger in the public for something that felt missing. Sincerity without performance. Conviction without branding. Foot, who had been punished for refusing to play the modern game, became a symbol of what the game had cost. But he was not a saint, and the story is not a fairy tale. He had made mistakes. He had led a divided party into a brutal defeat. He had underestimated the power of television and the cruelty of a press that could turn a coat into a verdict. He had believed sometimes that the moral argument would be enough, when politics also demands coalition, discipline, and strategy. His romantic faith in persuasion could become a weakness in a world that rewarded simplification. And yet, when you strip away the jokes, the core conflict of his life remains stark and real. Michael Foot spent his career fighting the idea that politics should be emptied of moral content. He fought it when appeasement was fashionable. He fought it when nuclear weapons were treated as normal. He fought it when unemployment was treated as a necessary sacrifice. He fought it when war was sold as a clean solution. And he fought it even when his own side decided that the only way back to power was to speak less about justice and more about what works. That fight cost him. It cost him the leadership. It cost him dignity in the eyes of millions. It cost him the chance to be remembered as a winner. But it also gave him something that winners don't always get. The ability to be right in ways that outlast the scoreboard. In his final years, he became physically frail. The famous mane of hair turned whiter, the body smaller, the voice softer. Yet the mind, so often underestimated, remained sharp. He could still summon history like a weapon. He could still quote, still argue, still laugh. He was to the end unmistakably himself. Bookish, stubborn, theatrical in the old sense. Someone who believed that public life was a stage where you were supposed to say what you meant. On March 3, 2010, Michael Foot died at the age of 96, and then the country performed one of its strangest rituals. It mourned the man it had once humiliated. Obituaries called him principled. They called him kind. They called him a great parliamentarian. They remembered his courage against fascism, his defense of civil liberties, his refusal to treat nuclear annihilation as a normal policy tool. They remembered his generosity to younger politicians, his loyalty to friends, his love of literature. They remembered, too, the tragedy of 1983, But now it was framed less as a punchline and more as a warning about how politics can punish sincerity. His legacy is not a law with his name on it, not a decade of government, not a monument in a square. It is something harder to measure and easier to lose. A model of political life in which ideas are not marketing and compassion is not weakness. He left behind a question that still burns, because it is not about him. It is about us. If a man can be destroyed by a photograph of a coat, what does that say about the voters, the media, the parties, the whole machine? That decides who is serious and who is not. And if decades later, that same man can be mourned as a symbol of integrity, what does that say about the hunger we feel when politics becomes nothing but performance? Michael Foot ran out of time, as everyone does. But he did not run out of words. And in the end, the words are what remain. A stubborn insistence that a country is not an economy, that power is not virtue, that war is not a habit to be shrugged at, and that the people at the bottom of the ledger are not footnotes. History tried to file him away as an embarrassment. Instead, he became a reminder, uncomfortable, inconvenient, and strangely hopeful, that politics can still be a matter of conscience, even when conscience is the most expensive thing a politician can afford.